Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In sacred scripture, the Church Fathers find various references to an order of love or charity. In Latin, Ordo Amoris, Ordo Caritatis. One such reference is Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 4. More important still is Christ's teaching that all the law and the prophets depend on 2 commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus thereby teaches that one should love God first and above all else, then oneself, and third, one's neighbor as oneself. However, just like the lawyer to whom Jesus imparts this teaching in Luke 10, verse 29, people have always had many questions about the exact implication of these 2 commandments. Here then are some books from the Church's tradition that introduce the concept of the order of love, develop it, and spell out its implications. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode. First, the Song of Songs, Commentary and Homilies by Origen of Alexandria. Second, On Christian Teaching by St. Augustine. Third, Questions on Love and Charity, Summa Theologiae, Secunde Secunde, questions 23 to 46 by St. Thomas Aquinas. Fourth, The Church Speaks to the Modern World, the Social Teachers of Leo XIII, and The Church and the Reconstruction of the Modern World, the Social Encyclicals of Pius XI. And fifth, Catechism of the Catholic Church by St. John Paul II. If you have time, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Recently, there has been a debate among Christians and the chattering classes over the order of love and its bearing on public policy. Surprisingly, this debate was not set off by the Pope, a pastor, or a professor, but by a politician. A remark made by US Vice President J.D. Vance in an interview with Fox News at the end of January. During the interview, Vance referenced the order of love in all but name when justifying the current administration's clampdown on illegal immigration. He said, but it's this old school concept, and I think a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. End of the quotation. Vance went on to charge the far left with adopting policies that invert this order. In the ensuing X storm, formerly Twitter storm, quite a few posts contested the biblical pedigree of the notion. Some did so quite vociferously. For example, Joash Thomas stated, "I'm a theologian trained at one of America's top conservative evangelical theological seminaries. This is not a Christian concept. It's a Western individualistic one." End of the quotation. There's been plenty of commentary on Vance's remarks, which are already yesterday's news. Still, the more thoughtful souls may be wondering whether the order of love is a biblical teaching, and if so, what bearing it has on our lives. For those who wanted to study the matter more closely, here are 5 books on the order of charity. The great 3rd century biblical scholar and theologian, Origen of Alexandria, was the first to bring many Christian doctrines into focus. The order of love is a case in point. He does so in his commentary on the Song of Songs, Book 3, Chapter 7. Specifically, he finds a reference to the order of love in Songs, Chapter 2, verse 4. It is difficult to find any such reference in a modern translation of the Bible. Take the Revised Standard Version, Catholic Edition. It translates the verse as, "He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love." However, the Greek and Latin translations used by the Church Fathers render the verse somewhat differently. And bear in mind that the authors of the New Testament used the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. In the version of the Septuagint that Origen references, the verse is, "Order love in me." In the Latin translation that Augustine uses, it is rendered as, "He set in order charity in me." Ordinabit in me caritatem. Accordingly, both Origen and Augustine speak, on the strength of this verse, of the order of love or charity. Arguably, this is still not sufficient proof of the concept's biblical pedigree. It could be objected that Origen and Augustine rely on a questionable translation of Song chapter 2 verse 4. However, they rely on the available translations for the term order of love, not for the substance of the concept. For the concept, they rely on the whole sweep of sacred scripture. In explaining rightly ordered love, Origen refers principally to the two commandments on which the law and the prophets hang, as Jesus teaches us in Matthew chapter 22, verses 35 to 40, Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 34, and Luke chapter 10, 25 to 28. He also appeals to the way in which God has arranged all things by measure and number and weight. That's a quote from Wisdom chapter 11, verse 10. In other words, Origen is arguing that the order in which we should love things is determined by the way in which God forms, governs, and sanctifies creation. While order of love is not a direct quote from the Bible, and the way in which the Church Fathers draw the term from Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 4 is questionable, the concept is deeply biblical. It refers to an order that is described in Scripture as a whole. That order is rooted in the nature of things and God's ordering of creation. It is implicit in the two commandments on which all the law and the prophets depend. Only because there is such an order should we love things in that order. Only because there is such an order can we distinguish between ordered and disordered loves, between a love that is directed to the right things and in the right order, as opposed to loving things in the wrong order, or even loving the wrong things. In his commentary, Origen says, "We say that charity is out of order in a person when he either loves what he ought not to love, or else loves what he ought to love either more or less than it is right for him to do. In people of the latter kind, charity is said to be inordinate. But in the former, and they are very few, I think, those namely who go forward on the way of life and turn not aside to the right hand nor to the left, and those alone, charity is ordinate and keeps the order proper to itself." End of the quotation. Origen goes on to offer various considerations about whom we ought to love more than others. For example, he argues that one should have a special love for spouse, parent, or sibling. Still, his considerations on the order of love do not have the same systematicity of, say, St. Thomas Aquinas. Moreover, the spiritual life, not social teaching, is the main focus of his commentary on the Song of Songs. Origen's commentary on the Song of Songs, which has come down to us in Rufinus of Aquileia's Latin translation, coins the term order of love. This is one way in which this highly influential work has shaped Christian doctrine and spirituality over the centuries. As St. Jerome wrote to Pope Damasus, while Origen surpassed all writers in other books, in his Song of Songs, he surpassed himself. However, the Western Church's reflection on the order of love was shaped more decisively by St. Augustine. Perhaps St. Augustine's most celebrated reference to the order of love comes from the City of God, where he identifies rightly ordered love with virtue itself. Like Origen, he draws the notion from the Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 4. In the City of God, he says, "It seems to me that a brief and true definition of virtue is rightly ordered love. That is why in the Holy Song of Songs, Christ's bride, the City of God sings, 'Set charity in order in me.'" The relevant phrase in Latin from this quotation is "Definitio brevis et vere virtutis ordo est amoris." The order of love is a brief and true definition of virtue. However, St. Augustine's fullest explanation of rightly ordered love appears in an earlier work, his On Christian Teaching, De Doctrina Christiana. As the title suggests, this work is concerned with how Scripture and the Christian faith should be taught. In Book 1, Augustine develops an influential theory of biblical interpretation. Teaching, Augustine notes, conveys the truth about things through signs. To classify the various kinds of things about which Scripture teaches us, he draws on the Stoics. The Stoics had pointed out that actions are not just the internal choices we make, but the actual execution of those choices. The execution of a choice consists in making actual use, in Greek chresis, of our powers, members, and external realities. The virtuous person, therefore, will use the right things and use them properly. Moreover, the virtuous person will find enjoyment, in Greek chara, in the appropriate things. Augustine agrees and assumes that Scripture teaches us about which things are meant to be enjoyed, in Latin frui, and which things are meant to be used, uti, and about which things can be both enjoyed and used. To enjoy something is to adhere to it and love it for its own sake. We use things, on the other hand, to attain what we love for its own sake. Hence, only that which is absolutely good deserves to be loved for its own sake alone. Happiness consists in the enjoyment of such a good, namely God. Creatures, on the other hand, are meant to be used for God's sake. Following Romans chapter 1, verses 20 to 21, Augustine believes everyone is aware of this truth. We must not enjoy a creature, therefore, as if it were an absolute good, even though we may be inclined to do so. That is not only inappropriate, but also impedes human fulfillment. Instead, we should make use of a creature according to its real, though relative value. This also leads us to happiness. Certain creatures, however, are worthy of both enjoyment and love, not just use. Such creatures are ends in themselves, albeit in a qualified sense. The commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself indicates that each human is such an end. The precept of love for God, on the other hand, indicates that one's love of self and neighbor must ever be directed towards love for God. At any rate, the commandment to love one's neighbor indicates that those with whom we have association, those who commune with us and with God, namely other humans and the angels, and that part of the self that can receive God's benefits, namely the body, are deserving of love. Hence, the four things that deserve our love are the one that is above us, God. The other is the thing that we are, namely the self. That which consists of those who stand alongside us, our fellow humans, the angels. And finally, one which is below us, our body. Moreover, we should love them in this order. This way of classifying things might seem odd for a work about the teaching of the Christian faith. For Augustine, however, Christian teaching is not just about what we should believe, it's also about what we should hope for and love. Accordingly, one of Augustine's works of catechesis, the Handbook of Faith, Hope, and Charity, is structured around the three theological virtues. The things about which Scripture teaches us are the ones we should love and the order in which we should love them. Some appeal to the order of love, however, to explain that some of our neighbors have a greater claim on one's love than others. This is not Augustine's view. In On Christian Teaching and some other works, he argues that, in principle, everyone is equally deserving of one's love. This is because every human is created in God's image and likeness. Ties of kin or kingdom do not give someone an inherent claim of preference. However, it is impossible to give everyone an equal share of one's love. In practice, therefore, you should give most attention to those who are closest to you in terms of time, place, or some other circumstance. Although Augustine's On Christian Teaching does not mention the order of love explicitly, it develops the notion significantly and provides a framework for addressing various moral problems. For example, in Book 1 of his The City of God, Augustine clarifies that suicide is always wrong by showing how it is contrary to love of self. He argues that murdering others can only be wrong if killing oneself is wrong. Murdering another person goes against love of neighbor. However, if you should love your neighbor as yourself, murder is an act against love of neighbor if, and only if, suicide goes against love of self. Murder is wrong, as the fifth commandment teaches us. That can only be the case if killing oneself goes against love of self. Medieval theologians such as St. Thomas Aquinas were familiar with the main ideas of St. Augustine's On Christian Teaching and deeply influenced by it. This was mainly because Peter Lombard drew heavily on the work in his Sentences, which for over 4 centuries was the main theology textbook in the West. Consequently, as Thomas Osborne has argued, Augustine's account of the order of love became the driving force behind medieval ethical theories. Moreover, the most important medieval writer on ethics is St. Thomas Aquinas. He discusses the order of love in various works, but most systematically in his Summa Theologiae. He does so in the second part of the second part, questions 25 to 26. These 2 questions belong to the section on the theological virtue of charity. The first of these 2 questions works out what we should love with charity, the second, the order in which we should love them. While St. Thomas is deeply influenced by St. Augustine, he also disagrees with him on an important part, and thereby shapes the subsequent tradition decisively. In certain passages, Augustine argues that in principle, every other human has an equal claim in our love. St. Thomas disagrees. He argues that in principle, those who either have a greater similarity to God in some regard, or are more closely united by natural or societal bonds, are inherently more entitled to one's love and should be given preference. Thomas also clarifies the regard in which you should love yourself more than any neighbor. While there can be circumstances in which you should love your neighbor more than your own bodily well-being, you should never love your neighbor more than your own soul. There can be grounds to sacrifice your health and life for the good of others. However, you should never sin for the sake of others. Of course, these 2 questions do not explain all the various implications and applications of the order of love. Working out all its various implications is complicated. That is what St. Thomas does over the rest of this section of the Summa Theologiae, the Secunda Secundae, when addressing questions such as almsgiving or ownership. Indeed, his treatment of these and many other questions have become the basis of the Church's official teaching. It is also worth bearing in mind that while the doctrine of the order of love is a Christian one and unpacks Christ's teaching on the two fundamental commandments, it's not a truth that is known through revelation alone. Rather, it is a truth that no one cannot not recognize. It is a truth of natural law. Like Augustine, Thomas insists that the two commandments of love of God and love of neighbor are fundamental precepts of natural law. In the Summa Theologiae, he says, they are the first and common precepts of natural law, which are known to human reason in virtue of themselves, both by nature and by faith. Hence, all the precepts of the Decalogue are referred back to those two in the manner of conclusions to common principles. End of the quotation. Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.